Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And like many other guests on this show, I see papers that come up in my Google alerts. And if it's something that's applicable to this audience, I want to get in touch with the author and I want to share it. So I saw a Baker Institute report that came out recently called Policies to Prevent Gun Violence in Schools. And when I contacted the author, it turns out that he's doing quite a bit more than just this policy paper. Dr. Cedric Dark is a practicing emergency physician in the Houston area. He's an associate professor at Baylor College of Medicine, and he's got a new book out called Under the Gun, an ER doctor's cure for the gun epidemic. Dr. Dark, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. And most of all, thank you for actually reading a paper.
That's pretty rare. And I think that's one of the great things about podcasts now is you put a paper out there, especially if it's a peer-reviewed academic paper. It sits behind a paywall and maybe 20 people read it. But when you can come on a podcast and talk for an hour about your research, it can get a huge audience.
No, that's very true. And I would like to thank you for reaching out to me and some of my co-authors. I'd like to just mention them briefly. Dr. Sandy McKay over at the University of Texas, and Kelly Walker, who's a medical student who actually did most of the bulk of the heavy lifting, as the medical students usually do. When the faculty get involved, we say, hey, we got a cool project we're thinking of. Would you want to help out? And she lifted this up. And I think we've been working on it for about 2 years till we finally got it out. So thanks again.
So before we get into that paper and get into the book, within medicine, there are so many different options, as you're a med student and into med school. And you can go into cardiology or you go into anesthesia or go into ortho and have this great lifestyle and a really high salary. But you decided emergency medicine. And that's a difficult job. It's long hours forever. It's relatively low pay in the world of medicine. What about emergency medicine stood out to you?
Well, first of all, when I was in high school, there was a TV show on that Noah Wiley starred in that some people probably don't even remember now, called ER, because he's in another one currently called The Pit. And it showed like what emergency medicine was like. And I think at the time, many people view this as one of the more realistic shows about emergency medicine. I wasn't necessarily thinking I wanted to do ER, but I do remember watching that show and being very fond of it in its early years. When I wound up doing college, I knew I wanted to do pre-med, and I did that. And I actually thought I was going to be a surgeon ultimately. And one of my cousins happens to be a surgeon. He's a few years older than me, so he was in his residency as I was applying to medical schools. And I remember hanging out with him in California for like a week or so during the summer. And I realized I do not want to be a surgeon. They wake up far too early in the morning. And then I hit medical school. And when I first got to med school, it was August of 2001. And 2 weeks later was 9/11. And as first year med students, when 9/11 happened, and I was in New York at the time, we were in a class that morning, heard about the news, went up to the roof of the building where our classroom was and saw the towers burning with our own eyes before the second one collapsed. And so we sprang into action, tried to figure out what can we as 2-week-old medical students do to help out, and it turned out not much. But that was one of the formative things, I think, in my early career. And then a few years later, med students usually do 2 years of book work, and then they do 2 years of clinical work. When we hit the clinical work, there was this massive blackout in the Northeast U.S. in 2003. And I wound up volunteering some time to help out in the emergency department then, and just got to love it. And every time I did a clinical rotation, the time that I felt most at home was when I would go downstairs to the ED to admit the patient, whether it was the neurology service, the surgery service, medicine service, etc. The ER felt more like home to me, and ultimately that's what I decided to do.
It's really interesting that, at least for kind of our generation, we have these natural disasters and terrorist attacks that really ground everything that is kind of our identity. For me, it's 9/11, and it was responding to Hurricane Katrina. And
Mhm.
those were the two events that got me into emergency management and homeland security. And ultimately, that led me down the path to end up working on the school shooting database. But it's almost like for the kids today, and it's strange to even think of them as the kids today. I don't think that they have some of those same grounding events like we have, where 9/11 meant so much to everyone, and there was this collective sense of efficacy, and we all wanted to help. And I think that that was probably the
Mhm.
same with the Northeast blackout and then Hurricane Katrina. So it seems like you just that kind of built this desire to start helping people that were complete strangers, just because when there's a major crisis, it called to you.
Yeah, it certainly did that, and I find it what's odd now. I actually worked a night shift over the weekend. I was working, and there were a couple nurses there that were born after 9/11, which just tells me how I'm like slowly aging in this healthcare field, and a new crop of people are popping up. And that's one of those things. Like, no matter what, though, I think there's a core group of people that really like, for lack of a better term, running into the fire, or going where crisis is and working in those situations. Some people, are really hands on, want to fix things, and those are the folks that go into orthopedics, right? Or surgery. And then there's some people that are like super duper intellectual, and as we say, love thinking something to death. And they are internists or are infectious disease doctors that are really, really cognitive in what they do. So everybody in medicine finds a role that fits them. And that's one of the great things about our field, because you can be hyper specialized so that you are literally like the pinky toe surgeon, or you can be very general like family medicine, whatever floats your boat.
And what seems a little different about uh, your contributions to the field, as opposed to a lot of people that just might spend most of their time focused on medicine, is you're a pretty prolific writer. When I looked you up on Google Scholar, you've got quite a few publications across multiple areas, but a lot on gun violence. So, what started to kind of pique your interest in wanting to research and then ultimately kind of bring forward policy recommendations around gun violence reduction?
Well, a couple things. Number one, I've always enjoyed writing, going back to high school and like creative writing class, and I did creative writing in college, and I worked for our college newspaper as a photographer. So that's like one half of my brain. The other half, I think, happened in medical school. Between my third and fourth year, I wound up taking a year off to go to Columbia and do a master's of public health at their public health school. And I learned a lot about what you can do from the public health side of the coin as opposed to the private medicine side of the coin. When you're doing private medicine, you can help one person one at a time. And that's extraordinarily rewarding because you can actually see what you do, sometimes in minutes or seconds. Quite frankly, when someone comes in with a heart attack or having a stroke or major trauma, you can fix them right then and there. Public health, on the other hand, gives you impact. It gives you the ability to treat, hundreds, thousands, millions of people simultaneously all at once. But you don't necessarily see that individual impact like you would. And so I started to see myself as working on both aspects of this. And again, the best way I like to describe it is a coin with two sides to it, because they don't really um, touch one another, but they're so intertwined in terms of how medicine and public health work together.
And then being in so first, kind of where have your rotations across your training, like what cities have you worked in across the country to ultimately get you to Houston? Because I think there may be some kind of unique aspects of being in Texas, being in a very
Mhm.
permissive gun state in the American South, where the experiences, working in a hospital could be pretty different based on kind of where you are geographically.
Right. So I never grew up with guns. I wound up going to college in Atlanta at Morehouse College, an HBCU, and wound up taking a course called outdoor education where we did, you know, hiking and a bunch of other things. But one of the things we did was skeet shooting. It's the first time I ever really shot a gun. And, it was enjoyable. It wasn't anything that I said, oh, I got to keep doing this forever. But I filed that away in the back of my mind. And then I went to New York.
I will I
Er,
will tell you one. I also have not done a lot of skeet shooting, but I did once, and two of the clays crossed at exactly the same time.
mhm.
And I was very novice shooter, and I hit both of them with the same shell. And in the shock of that, ejected the second shell, and it flipped up and landed back in the ammo bag.
Uh-huh.
And I said, I'm done. It's never going to get better. There's
No,
never going to be a better shot than that one. So we're just going to set this aside.
yeah, leave when you're at your peak, you know.
But,
So after
but
Atlanta, I
yeah,
went to New
sorry
York.
to derail you there.
Yeah, no worries. Went to New York, as I said, and was there for 5 years. Then after that, did emergency medicine training. My intern year was at Washington Hospital Center, and then we were in this weird program that at the time was transitioning from, it was a 1+3 program, which none of them do that anymore. They're either a 3-year or 4-year emergency medicine program. But I wound up going to GW for years 2 through 4. And so I practiced in DC, Maryland suburbs, and the Virginia suburbs for those next 3 years learning emergency medicine. And then after that, then I went out into private practice, as it were, and worked for a hospital in Baltimore. But it was a small community hospital, wasn't a trauma center or anything like that. And then eventually moved to Houston, which now where I work is a level 1 trauma center. So it's one of the big trauma centers in the city. And I see that daily toll of gun violence every single day. And so, yeah, that kind of just becomes your life over time, especially in this field. If you're in acute care surgery, if you're in emergency medicine, you're going to see these kinds of traumatic injuries, whether it's someone getting bludgeoned with a brick or stabbed or shot or car wrecks, all those things. And it just happened that when I was doing a lot of my public health facing activities, I was blogging when blogs were cool. Many years ago. And my focus there was what I like to call evidence-based health policy, and focusing on what does the data show us that we can do and implement in the policy world to save people's lives. And that was across all fields. But then over time, it narrowed down. And specifically on the topic of gun violence, it narrowed down because the NRA sent a tweet telling doctors to stay in their lane.
Stay in your lane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's where all this stuff took off for me.
Yeah, because I mean that is your lane. Washington D.C. being at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, there's a shooting in the district every day. Baltimore, unfortunately, a low population city, a very low socioeconomic city, pretty significant gun violence rate compared to others across the country. So yeah, you've certainly seen it, and in the school shooting data, which I study, unfortunately, Baltimore and Washington D.C. are two of the cities that um, come up at a much higher rate than a number of others. So that kind of brings us to this Baker Institute paper, which I first saw because you said you're interested in evidence-based medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So this paper is about the policies to prevent gun violence in schools. So kind of where did this paper come specifically, and what caused you to focus on schools for this?
Well, so in the previous 5 years, I've actually been writing the book Under the Gun, and I had taken a look through the Rand Corporation's report to talk about a bunch of policies out there, things like universal background checks or safe storage, etc. But there wasn't a ton in their report on school safety. And maybe a couple of years ago, I was on a panel at the Baker Institute talking about firearms policy, and just afterwards was speaking with a few of the people that are part of the institute about something I could do in terms of working on a white paper with them and trying to get some information out. And we eventually settled on this concept of um, school violence because we didn't really have a ton of information that was out there in summary form that I had come across in my research for the book. And there probably is some stuff out there, which I found the peer reviewed literature as I was preparing for this. But there's still areas, I think, where we need more information in order to figure out what's the best way to influence our politicians and our communities to take action.
And then on that, there. So the organization of the paper is around students and police and educators, and it ultimately leads to a series of policy implications. Um, but there's kind of one finding in here which I've tried to state over and over, which is the number of kids that are habitually carrying guns in schools. Uh, your footnoted piece is that it's 1 in 20 students have carried a firearm to school, based on triangulation of CDC data, survey data, and monitoring Google alerts on arrests and extrapolating that to kind of broader numbers. My estimate is about 600,000 students carry a gun into school every year, which comes out to about 2% of students. So sounds like we're similar. What in your experience, because you're dealing with kids, you're dealing with teenage gunshot victims, why are so many kids carrying guns?
Well, I think some of the reasons are kids don't feel safe. And so some of them default to trying to protect themselves with firearms. They may have been victims of bullying, witnesses to firearm violence, or living in a community where firearm violence is prevalent. I think that's probably a large reason. Some of the things that we saw, in the information is that the types of students that show up with guns, usually it's boys over girls, but also sexual orientation minorities, so gay, lesbian, transgender, the LGBTQ community. Sometimes we see, rural communities, it's more prevalent just because it's more cultural in that sense. So those are a few of the things that we've noticed. But yeah, it's kind of a shocking number if you think about it. Average class has probably got at least 20 students in it. So to think that someone in there is carrying a firearm is shocking.
And I mean, it happens. So your first policy recommendation or policy implication on this is that it's really important to prevent children from accessing guns and having safe and secure storage. And I mean, an example of that is just yesterday in Fredericksburg, Virginia, just outside of the DC metro area, a third grader had a gun in their backpack and it discharged inside the elementary school classroom with 30 other kids in the classroom. And that's something that I see at least once a month, is some sort of accidental discharge from a young kid. In this case, a third grader. So what do you see as just kind of a practical path forward on pushing for safe and secure storage?
Yeah, I think that's, to me, the first and foremost thing that needs to happen, because it's the simplest thing that parents can do. Again, most of these, first of all, kids shouldn't be buying guns. They can't go to the store and buy them themselves, for the most part. And so the only way that they actually have access to them, is that they're either purchasing them illegally somewhere, or their parents are giving them to them, or they're obtaining them from their household. And I think that's the first step. If we as adults are going to demand that we want our schools to be safer, we have to demand ourselves to take responsibility. And gun owners, I'm a gun owner myself, have to be responsible, first of all. Um, to the point where we lock our firearms up if we're not using them. And I think this gets into the whole aspect of why do people have firearms in their home, and many times it's for home protection. So folks will think that it's contrary to lock your firearm up if you want it available for home protection. But I think at the same time, when you have children in your house, more often than not, some of the data will show that you're actually going to do harm rather than benefit. And so I'd really encourage people to second guess the necessity of keeping their firearms out and available. Because again, it doesn't
Yeah,
take much for a kid to find it, put it in a backpack, take it to school.
yeah, and I mean, with thinking about the public health perspective and looking at broader data and trends, is that there are tens of thousands of people injured and killed, mostly unintentionally, with firearms in the home every year. There are, you know, dozens of people that are intentionally harmed during home invasions. So you have something where the most innocent victim in your house, a child with 4 years old, being the most common age for a kid to accidentally shoot themselves because they are, tall enough to find the gun in a drawer or a dresser. They're able to, squeeze the trigger, but they have no idea what they're doing. So it's very unlikely that you're going to be killed by a stranger who comes into your house. But it's much more likely that somebody in your house is going to be injured. You also have two implications around background checks and raising the minimum age for firearms. I think that that's really interesting. One of my recent guests is Dr. Jens Ludwig from University of Chicago in the crime lab there. And he finds that your gun violence is most common in older teenagers, younger adolescents, people that do not yet have not only the fully formed brain, but you don't have the perspective on situations to know that this argument isn't worth turning into a shooting. And if you just raise the threshold a little bit across all types of violent crime, people age out of crime. So you don't want to have somebody have access to a gun during the period when they are least prepared socially and psychologically to be in a high stakes situation.
It's very true what you're saying. And again, these are two items that I am huge on, and I think the evidence is pretty certain that raising the age to 21 helps reduce deaths. A lot of that actually happens to be through suicides amongst teens and the 19 and 20-year-old population, just by reducing access to deadly means of suicide. And then the background check issue, we also know if you are going to purchase a firearm, you usually have to get a background check prior to doing so. That helps out with your violent crime and your homicides as well. So again, raising the age to 21 is a huge policy that if it's not implemented in your state, you as a listener ought to go out and talk to your state legislatures, because it's one of those things that not all this stuff has to happen at the federal level. A lot of this policy is state based, and that's really where the fight is in terms of advocating for safer laws and legislation regulations.
Yeah, that's a huge point where there's the least amount of participation in local and state elections, but essentially so many regulations and so many policies like safe storage or something that's a state or a local level decision. Something that many states have moved away from in recent years is either licensing or training requirements, but that's also one of your recommendations. What kind of evidence is there around your risk reduction from people having mandated firearms training?
Yeah, it's clearly shown that when you're doing things like, concealed carry, and most concealed carry licenses come with some sort of training requirements, that if you require that more stricter levels of concealed carry laws, that lives can be saved from that. And one of the very interesting things from in this paper, we went back and we looked at data going into like 1963, so like all the way back to the Kennedy assassination. There's this really interesting paper out that talked about firearm education in schools, which is really not something that I feel like we do in our schools today. And this was, I think, at the high school level, and it talked about their curriculum and all this kind of stuff. And when you talk to teachers think that they ought to have training in schools as well, but they don't feel confident in it because they're out there teaching math or teaching science, teaching English. They're not designed to every teacher to be out there teaching firearm safety. But it's something that I think they would agree should be done, and it's actually something that I think is a reasonable thing to consider. I mean, we've had problems keeping art in schools, or keeping sort of the softer kind of subjects out there. But this may be one of those other softer subjects that might be important for people to consider having in their school districts.
And then you've got another policy implication around increasing funding for mental health monitoring and resources. But you have a slightly different angle to that, which is it should be training that's specifically geared to parents. Because most of the time when you hear about mental health resources, especially in schools, it's a more discipline focused piece that we're going to have a formal threat assessment team. It's doing a formal assessment of students. Based on that, we're mandating or connecting students with different levels of assistance. But how do you see this as a program that's geared towards parents?
I do think that the investment in sort of behavioral risk assessment is key, because that's something where identifying the risk of violence in someone that might commit violence at the school level is highly important. But again, it does involve parents too. I think you can't just do the risk assessments in the schools but not have anything happening once the kid gets home as well. I think if kids are troubled, or there's things going on in the house that are making them depressed or whatever, those are things that you're going to need parental involvement. Again, this is, and the reason that, we wrote this from the different viewpoints of multiple stakeholders, whether it's the teachers and principals or the students themselves or the parents, is because it takes everybody to actually address this problem. And you can't just focus on one aspect.
And then the final recommendation in here is around uh, looking at risk factors. And I think that that's really important because gun violence risk, just like risk of an illness or risk of injuries, is not the same for all people in all places. And you've identified some risks around gender and sexual identity, geographic location, the previous history of violence, and a record of bullying. So where did those risk factors come from, and how much do they impact the potential for somebody to commit violence?
Yeah, I mean, they come from the data. So again, we pulled up all this research and looked through it, and those were the consistent things that we saw that demonstrated risk of carrying a weapon. And again, you're not going to shoot somebody unless you have a gun on you in the first place. So that's probably a reasonable first place to start. And I think some of those things, like the gender and sexual identity thing, were very surprising to me. I didn't necessarily think of it that way. But again, this is why policy should be evidence informed, as opposed to just throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what sticks.
No, we've done that with violence prevention for 20 years or 30 years, and a lot of the programs that work at the grassroots level haven't been broadly institutionalized because people aren't studying them, and a lot of heavy top-down procedures really haven't made meaningful changes. So this paper is just a tiny portion of your book, the book Under the Gun, and ER Doctors' Cure for the Gun Epidemic. What are some of the other kind of key issues that are in this book?
So yeah, the paper was written because I didn't really get to cover this in the book, so it's kind of a supplement to it. There are some things that we mentioned, and we've gone over those: child access prevention laws, minimum age requirements, and universal background checks. But I think some of the other stuff that's in there, one of which is domestic violence restraining orders, and specifically those that allow law enforcement to remove firearms from people that have a restraining order put on them. That's a huge area that needs to be improved upon. There's other things like waiting periods and licensing and permitting, that have been demonstrated to show benefits if you actually require people to wait, not long, but maybe up to a week to get a firearm. Whereas in reality, you can literally go to a store here. The FBI background check electronically takes 2 minutes on average, and then you can have a gun and walk out the store with it. Which, if you are someone that's angry at another person or feeling suicidal, like, you can harm yourself pretty quickly in that sense. Another thing that is in the book, I talk a little bit about, and it's probably one of the more controversial things, is like stand your ground laws, because stand your ground laws have been demonstrated to increase violence when they've been passed in certain places. And I think we've seen this, at least anecdotally, in certain states like Florida, with the death of Trayvon Martin. And I mean, just you drive around or watch the local news and you hear about all the road rage incidents out there. It's very easy for something that's kind of minor to escalate into a fatal confrontation. And I think Stand Your Ground facilitates that. The data would bear it out.
That's interesting. So in Dr. Jens Ludwig's new book, which is centered on Chicago, he looks at the homicide data in the city back to the 1960s. and 80% of the homicides that occurred in Chicago with firearms were disputes that escalated into shootings. They were not premeditated, and overwhelmingly, they weren't people that had prior serious criminal history or any intent to harm people. What there is a 10-minute window where somebody's angry and a really bad decision happens. And to your points on concealed carry and on stand your ground laws, those are things that decrease friction. And by decreasing friction, it means it makes it really easy for somebody to do something. And if you have laws that allow somebody to carry a firearm anywhere, carry it without taking a training class that teaches them about the consequences, teaches them about legal frameworks, starts developing some sort of decision-making architecture around when is it right to use this or not right to use this. And then you create a legal structure where there's going to be, if I'm here in my car, I'm standing my ground. If I'm here on my front yard, I'm standing my ground. That's creating even less repercussions. So now you've reduced 3 points of friction. The gun is right there and accessible for something to escalate. You don't have a framework to think about the consequences. And even if there are consequences, they're unlikely to be bad because you know you have this stand your ground framework. I mean, that all seems to align into making a 10-minute window of bad decisions into a really a dangerous and fatal outcome.
Absolutely.
Are there any things that kind of came up in your research? We talked about some of the demographic differences, but just really surprised you. That's, back to this fights that escalate with the school shooting database. I started this right after Parkland about 7 years ago because I wanted to know the who, what, where, when, and why of the rampage attacks at schools, the Columbines and Sandy Hooks of Parklands. And there just wasn't good information about those incidents. So we couldn't tell why they were happening or what the changing characteristics were. But once I started recording gun violence at schools, I found out that those incidents are pretty rare. They're pretty isolated. Almost all of them can be prevented if you just spot the warning signs during the months or years before the attack. But the much more pervasive problem at schools is the fights that escalate into shootings, a robbery that turns into shootings, a domestic on campus, an accident like the one in the classroom yesterday. I didn't expect that there's actually this really systemic gun violence in schools that's based on all these other root causes that you're discussing. Is there kind of anything that came out of your research or writing this book that was just completely opposite of what you expected?
Yeah, there's two things. I think the first is what you just alluded to and what I like to call the daily trickle of gun violence, right? I've been an ER doctor for 15 to 20 years or so now. And thankfully, I've never had to really deal with a mass casualty situation like a Parkland or something along those lines because they are extraordinarily rare, right? But someone getting shot on a Sunday night, that is not rare. Had a couple of those last night or, the other night when I was working. And when you look at the number of school shootings, right, and the number of school shooting fatalities, in some years, it's actually relatively equivalent to or less than the number of people killed by police. And I think when we put it in that context, it really should make us think that why are we spending so much time and effort talking about a school shooting, with a 24-hour news cycle and all this other kind of stuff that traumatizes people, but we're not focused on why are police killing people, especially unarmed people, especially unarmed Black men. Those are things that I think our perspective has been twisted by the mainstream media, as it were. So that's one surprise. I think the other thing, too, is we focus a lot, and I hear so many talking points on things like assault weapon bans. And when you go back to the science from this RAND report that I'm talking about, it says that banning assault weapons doesn't necessarily save people's lives. Now, we would have to get into a far more nuanced conversation about, statistical power and all these other things to figure out why that association hasn't been proven. But in reality, I am more concerned about who has access to firearms than what types of firearms they have access to. And so I think that that's where my focus is most of all. I will say, as a caveat to what I just said, even though the assault weapons ban may not do anything, restricting large capacity magazines, magazines that can carry 20 to 30 or however many bullets, does save people's lives. Because one, if you have to stop to reload, then someone has an opportunity to escape that they may not have had before. So those are probably the two surprising things that I found.
Yeah, and on the point about assault weapons, specifically kind of the semi-automatic rifles, from studying specifically planned attacks at schools back to the 1960s, and I've looked in detail at about 230 different incidents, there has been a significant change since the late 2000s, where from the 1960s through about the mid 2000s, there were more people wounded than killed at most of the planned attacks. Once the AR-15 rifle or similar rifles became really commonplace, which the sales have just expanded since some changes in marketing and the expiration of the assault weapons ban, and some decisions within the firearm industry, when the attacks have involved semi-automatic rifles, there are usually more fatalities than injuries. And that's been one change that I've seen objectively. But overall, really the biggest problem in schools every day is the ease of getting a handgun and the ease of carrying a concealed handgun. Because what that does is turns a simple fight in the hallway into a bunch of random students shot in the hallway.
Yeah, and I agree with you on all those points. But I think it creates another opportunity for us to have more research, and specifically more peer-reviewed research, because I think that's what is going into these broader studies and meta-analyses or systematic reviews when we're talking about it from the evidence-based perspective, and finding those opportunities where we can identify natural experiments. Maybe some states have a ban on assault weapons versus others that don't, or looking at it, as you said, in the gradual change in the prevalence of the type of weapons used in a shooting, and then sort of a fatality rate versus injury rate may be indicative. I'm not all the way into the weeds to know about how those studies were done. Usually they're done more on the policy side of it during the assault weapons ban that was in effect for about 10 years, which makes it hard to study the effect because there's a single point where everything is on, things are off, and then they're back on again. Whereas if we look at it a little bit more nuanced way, kind of like the way you're just talking, and for those of your real researchers out there that are listening, that would be a great research question, I think, that would fill a gap.
On research right now, I mean, you're a prolific writer and you've got a ton of published research out there. The landscape for research funding, specifically anything related to gun violence, is about to change dramatically. Do you have any recommendations, or what do you think the potential impacts are, and who needs to pick up the slack over the next 2 or 3 years to make sure that we don't have a significant setback in understanding what is the number one killer of children and adolescents in this country?
It's probably more than a 2 to 3 year frame. This is probably about to be a 5 to 10 to 15-year frame, honestly, with all the changes that have been brought about by the new administration in terms of trying to cut research, indirect funding for universities. People are already losing their jobs that are supportive of the research apparatus at our universities, and so we're going to see things like injury prevention, firearm injury prevention research, which have been historically underfunded, probably take even more of a hit than even those things that we love to fund, like cancer research or cardiovascular disease research. There's a great paper and an even better figure out there that tracks research dollars over mortality of a specific condition, and you can see gun violence is way off that chart, off the normal curve as an outlier because it's so far underfunded. A large reason being the Dickey Amendment from the 1990s, which told CDC that none of the money that they gave away in grants could be used to advocate or promote gun control. Didn't say anything about doing research, but people were really hesitant to do it because they were afraid that their funding would be knocked. And I think now, as we're entering a period of time where intellectualism and science is being attacked on its face, we're going to see a lot of problems for people that are in the business of doing research, where that's their livelihood, because I think they're going to pick safe things. And firearm research has never been a safe thing.
No, not at all. And I know that because the small amount of funding I had was cut right after Uvalde based on some congressional Republicans that thought it reflected poorly on their political stance. And this is a grassroots project that I've just run myself since then. So in the landscape of reduced funding, reduced resources, kind of people losing their jobs, what do you see as the top priorities for the next couple years that people need to be doing around firearm injury and death prevention research? Like, what are the key things people need to be focused on and tracking?
That is a tremendously good question. Wow. Um, I mean, again, I think the main thing that we need right now is to research things that are different from what's already well studied. Number one, um, if we have a limited set of dollars, we shouldn't keep spending it in the same place. So, studying more of the things that we already know work, background checks, child access prevention, minimum age, we don't need to keep studying that. We need to focus on the other things that we think might work, right? So whether that happens to be violence intervention programs, I think we could still afford to research that. A program called Gun Buddies, or that I term Gun Buddies. There's a colleague of mine named Emmy Betts in Colorado who does suicide prevention research, and whose work revolves around the ability of people to hand their firearms to a friend or maybe to law enforcement when they're going through an emotional crisis or some other crisis in their life, so that when they're feeling down, they don't wind up shooting themselves. Studying programs like that would be helpful. I think those are some of the lower hanging fruit that we could invest on. But I think the other thing too is the research community really is going to have to start engaging the philanthropic community more. And I think the philanthropic community is going to have to step up because, as we can see, federal funding and state funding is going to be constrained in the coming years, at least for probably the next 3 to 4. And who knows how long it will take to ramp that back up. So what we really need to do is find funders out there that are willing to focus on this and also invest not only in the big researcher that already has a research institution, but also granting small little seed money to those people that are working on things that can help build a portfolio over time. And I think that's one of the difficulties that, or one of my gripes, honestly, with the process of research at the federal level is a lot of it is, I don't want to say an old boys club, but I think a lot of it is people that are doing the research fund other people that are already kind of in that pipeline, and it's harder to get it out to more people unless they follow that strict pipeline. There's reasons for it. Again, a lot more than we can probably cover, and very nuanced. But I would like to see, especially if the philanthropic community is a part of it, maybe finding ways where we can allow more investigators into the fray.
And that's such an important point that you made first there that I don't want to get lost in this, is that especially some of the big donors put money into organizations where every single report and press release that they put out has the same things that we already know work.
Mm-hmm.
We know that background checks work. We know that safe and secure storage works. We know that reducing children's access to guns works. We don't need another report and another study and another $1 million grant to go into that. I think that what's interesting about the school shooting database is, instead of just numbers and incidents, I have more than 300 variables, and those variables tell the who, what, where, when, and why of an incident. And from there, you can start seeing how they're different. And once you see how they're different, you can realize what types of interventions that would be effective or ineffective in reducing different types of incidents. The biggest firearm issue that I think everybody on both sides of the aisle could agree on right now is unintentional shootings, accidents in the home, mostly involving children, and suicides. We know numbers on those incidents. What we don't know is the who, what, where, when, and why. If you could take samples of that data and code it for the exact time period, the exact location, if it's in the house, where was it? Was it in a bedroom? Was it in a basement? Was it in a garage? What time of day? Are these things that happen in the afternoons? Was there a parent home or not at the time of the shooting? Had the person had, if it's a suicide, had they had formal mental health treatment before? Had they had prior suicide attempts before? There are all these things where once you start coding data for the really, really granular details, you can see all these patterns and you can see all these possible interventions. And maybe you come up with novel findings from that speak to things like gun buddies, that the majority of firearm suicides are maybe somebody who hasn't done X before or is in this situation for the first time. And a peer support would be somebody that would help diffuse them. Because just like most shootings are not premeditated and they're not wicked, violent people, there's somebody in a bad situation that has a gun present. Most suicides are during a very acute crisis. And if somebody has the means to commit suicide, it can have a bad outcome. If they don't, often they never attempt suicide again. So we have all of these ways through data that we can really make a big dent in problems I think everybody can agree on.
But how many statisticians do you have working on your project with you?
I have zero.
So again, like
Thankfully,
this is what I'm saying is, it's so hard. I have a whole academic apparatus behind me theoretically, but again, without like the statistician or in those things, which I don't necessarily have in my department, it's really hard to do health services research. So I've made my niche in not doing primary research myself, but reading about it and trying to make it digestible for the layman or for the policymaker. That's sort of where I find myself, because I'm not that person that's going to go out there and, number one, generate those numbers and or crunch those numbers and write those papers myself. Another thing that you mentioned about that granularity of data, and I wanted to bring this up. The CDC does this thing called a youth risk behavior surveillance system, and they ask students, have you ever carried a gun on campus? And they answer that, but they only ask about carrying a weapon on school property. They don't ask about carrying a gun on school property. It'd be really nice if they modified their questionnaire to be that specific.
or
Based
why
on
are
the
you
time frame.
carrying it?
Or why, but
Why are you carrying? Where did it come from?
yeah,
It's so simple. We can add a couple questions that cost nothing to add to a survey that can give us so much opportunity for prevention if we understand a couple more of the factors that go into why somebody checked yes or no.
right. But we also got to make sure that the CDC is still allowed to do this study, because who knows what's happened this week with what's going on in the federal government at the moment.
So before I get you out of here, you talked about, research papers. A lot of people don't get to read them. They're not digestible. There's not, we have limited resources to write them. Something that everybody at every level is interested in is good, high quality media and documentaries. You're right now the executive producer on a project that's looking at the impacts of youth gun violence. Can you talk about that at all? Because people love to watch compelling movies and whatever's on Netflix.
Yeah, this was a very random opportunity. I think they're the producers of a short film, and it's probably only going to be like 15 minutes long. Reached out to
Perfect.
a lot
That's
of us.
100 TikToks.
Yeah, it's like 100 TikToks all at once. But they reached out to a bunch of people that have been in this gun violence research community, and asked us to be executive producers, which more or less means, hey, can you help support the arts and help fund this thing? And so we reached into our pockets and helped out with that. And they filmed it, I think, back in September. They're editing it now. Hopefully they'll be submitting this to some film festivals and trying to do maybe some private screenings in the coming months. So I'm really excited to see it. But again, it's literally talking about the absurdity of the way we treat firearms, especially as it pertains to young kids. Um, you know, sort of at the high school level, and that's the subject of the film. That's about as much as I can say right now, because even the title itself is in flux. Right now, it's called Homecoming. Don't know if it's still going to stay Homecoming or not, but yeah, I'm excited to see the finished product and be able to share it with the world. And if anyone is listening from Netflix and wants to pick it up, please give me a call.
Sounds good. Well, I'll make sure that they have your contact information in the show notes. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Cedric Dark, he's got a new book out, Under the Gun and ER Doctor's Cure for the Gun Epidemic. He's an associate professor at Baylor College of Medicine and active practicing physician in the Houston area. Dr. Dark, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, no, I grew up there. In Maryland, PG County.